We do know that philosophically, SMEs are seen as the drivers of economic growth and employment in a country that really needs employment. Over 73% of people who work for small and medium enterprises. But are these statistics true?
Difficult to say, particularly in South Africa, because we don't have very reliable statistics. But yes, they are definitely. As you've just quoted, one of the researchers that have come out of Treasury, which basically stipulates, that 70% of all our hiring really takes place in firms employing less than 50 employees. But one of the recent stats that have come out, particularly from a Treasury perspective, is that there are about 1 to 3 million small firms operating in South Africa. But the vast majority of these are micro and survivalists. There's a very narrow band of small firms that actually are the employment generating growth potential small firms. And we're looking at about 200 to 650,000 small firms.
How can we measure that element of the SME being the differentiator? And I'm talking about the contribution in general of SMEs to GDP in the economy, because the productivity is what would determine the contribution.
Absolutely. Well, just on that narrow band, Treasury estimate that they contribute upwards of 50% to our GDP. And of course in Africa, you know, there's a missing middle that we talk about in terms of these value add small firms that exist. So there's a lot of micro, there are a lot of survivalist enterprises. And then there's obviously a few large corporates in the broader African economy. And then of course they've got this big missing middle. And that's the area that the SME Growth Index is going to hone in on.
Tell us more about the SME Growth Index and how it's going to go about the methodology of measuring whether or not SMEs do provide growth and jobs.
Well, it's exciting. It's going to be labour intensive. But essentially the SME Growth Index is going to focus on a panel of 500 small firms, those that employ between 10 to 49 employees, and are either in the manufacturing or business services sector. And we're going to monitor and measure and work with these SMEs on both a quantitative and a qualitative data. So we're going to be surfacing a lot of information that essentially makes these SMEs tick over a period of several years. So we're going to be looking at the same business and the same business owner over a period of several years on a very structured instrument, both from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. And the type of things that we're going to be looking at are issues around, for example, what are the internal characteristics and attributes of these small firms and business owners, but also how do they react to the environment, the regulatory environment, how does the labour laws, red tape impact on them, and so forth.
I'm very curious at the time span that you're talking about, because one of the biggest constraints that SMEs face is funding beyond the initial stages of formation, and the life cycle of the SME varies actually, depending on how often that small business is able to access funding to grow and keep going. So you do run the risk of starting a project and not being able to follow through.
The tricky bit there is, Loretta, we'll be monitoring, and this is an interesting issue, because we're going to see over the period of years whether the business owner maintains and continues with his own business, or whether there's other businesses that spin out. And obviously, we're going to have to obviously look at how many fail. But our key point is to actually follow the business owner and not just necessarily the business.
Is the index going to make any policy recommendations? We've just heard the South African budget for 2011-2012, and just less than R1 billion has been allocated towards SME support, business development, and some are saying that's really a pity, because if you see this as the catalyst to growth, you should really be directing a lot of the resources towards a jobs fund, but also some sort of an SME fund.
We hope that our key audience is government. We do actually have a panel of experts who are participating as technical advisors, and some of these are key policy strategists in government. And yes, we will be putting recommendations with the evidence to back it up in terms of what's working, what's not working, and what issues you need to concentrate on as government if you want to facilitate growth and job creation.
And very briefly, you spoke about the fact that you'll be focusing in particular on SMEs in the manufacturing and business services side.
Yeah.
Yes, manufacturing is critical. It constitutes 1/5 of South Africa's GDP, but some would argue that it's not necessarily the area where you're seeing dynamic activities.
Yeah, we're basically following, obviously because our key sort of audience is government, we're basically following their key sectors that they're looking at in the new growth path.